Hey there, scary story fanatics! Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. I hope you all had a lovely day to remember, for nothing is more squandered than a love truly lost. So, pull out the scrapbooks and realize things could have been worse. Love remembered.
"Hello, honey," Valerie said to her loving husband, who had come up from behind her to give her a loving hug. At the moment, Valerie was readying herself to head outside by taking her jacket from the coat rack and placing it on. Although it was a late spring, the mornings were still particularly chilly, requiring a light coat or a sweatshirt for the earlier parts of the day. Val was headed out to attend the yard, leaving her husband to do whatever it was he did on weekends. Lately, that consisted of spending an awful lot of time in the basement behind closed doors. Valerie was curious, but Charlie, her husband, asked her to stay out of the basement, his private place, as he called it. She trusted him. He had never given her a reason not to. She told Charlie she'd be in after weeding out the garden to enjoy a little breakfast, at which point Charlie smiled back and told her it was a date. Valerie stepped out the door and closed it behind her. The sun had just begun to peek over the mountains on the horizon to the east. A cool breeze wafted by and coincided with the song of morning birds. Cars could be heard occasionally passing by out front of the suburban home, but the setting of the backyard was tranquil and calm. The smell of dew and mist lingered in the crisp air. Gardens graced the exterior of the entire home, while others were sporadically landscaped throughout the expanse of the backyard. Weeding such a large amount of garden space took some time, but Valerie thoroughly enjoyed the work, as strenuous as it was. Morning glories and rhododendrons graced each and every garden, with 2 large rose bushes presented by the front door. Today, Valerie charged herself with extracting weeds from the gardens out back. She walked herself to the shed to the left, retrieved the wheelbarrow and a pair of thick gloves, and brought the items to her first location of the day. A few minutes had gone by when Val noticed her neighbor, Zach Wellman, step from the back door of his home and into his backyard as well, located right next to hers on the other side of the shrubs. Zach was a handsome man, and Valerie found herself thinking of him often. She also knew Charlie couldn't stand him, always telling her to keep away from him, glaring at him whenever he saw him outside. Charlie typically avoided contact with him altogether. Valerie watched Zach walk to the center of his yard, take in a long, enjoyable breath, and smile at the world around him. Amongst looking at the expanse of his yard, Zach's eyes finally rested upon Valerie's, bent over and pulling weeds from her garden. Valerie gave him a blushful smirk before focusing her attention back to the tasks at hand. However, before she turned away, she caught sight of a friendly wave from Zach as he began to walk towards her. Valerie pretended not to notice. "Hey, neighbor," Valerie heard from behind her. She turned with a smile to see Zachary standing above her, as she gave him a friendly hello back before the two became engrossed in conversation about gardening and current news events. After a while, Valerie spied something behind their neighbor. It was Charlie, peering through the window, a look of disgust on his face. "What is it?" Zachary asked as he looked behind him, taking note of Valerie's vacant stare. "Oh, probably nothing. I should get back to work," she replied, trying to end their conversation. "Oh, sure, no problem," Zach told her, catching her drift. he bid her a pleasant goodbye, wishing her a good day. Valerie blushed once again, waving in return, before returning to her gardening. As back-breaking as the work was, time seemed to pass quickly, the clouds giving way to sun shining high in the sky. Wheelbarrow full and brow thick with sweat. Valerie dumped the contents of the wheelbarrow behind the wood pile at the back of the yard before putting everything back where she had gotten it from. She was reminded of her breakfast promise when her stomach began to grumble. Valerie walked back through the door of her home and into the bathroom, located just to the right beyond the door. Washing her hands and face free of dirt in the sink, she knew that he would have something to say about her visit with the man next door, but it wasn't like she invited him over. It was just a friendly conversation between neighbors. Valerie came back out of the bathroom and headed into the kitchen to prepare a light brunch for herself and Charlie. When she entered the kitchen from around the corner, the first thing she saw was a glass vase holding a single red rose sitting upon the center of the kitchen island countertop. A small but noticeable smile graced over her face as she approached the object. Before she reached it, a large firm hand slapped her on the backside. Val turned and smiled, holding onto the countertop with both hands as she welcomed the sight of her husband. "I picked that for you while you were outside," Charlie told her with a smile and a loving hug. She told him she still needed to make them some late breakfast, passively asking him to allow her to do so. Charlie wouldn't let her go without a kiss. She gladly appeased him and went to grab the bagels next to the sink when Charlie asked her about the blood on her hand. Confused, Valerie began to inspect both of them to find that her right palm was bleeding. This was befuddling. She had no clue how she had both sustained injury and not noticed. After washing her hand once again in the kitchen sink, the rational explanation was plainly provided. She had seemed to have gotten a small wooden splinter under her skin that was likely masked by the amount of topsoil that they were previously covered with. The extremely small amount of blood that leaked from the wound was likely hidden as well. As for the pain, well, it didn't hurt at the moment, so it probably didn't hurt to begin with. It wasn't until she managed to free the object from her hand that her hypothesis fell apart. This wasn't just an ordinary splinter. It was a thorn. Valerie had no idea how she had gotten the thorn in her hand. She weeded the garden frequently, and the only thorns to be found in the gardens were boasted on the rose bushes out front. Charlie was looking at her a little strangely as she tried to remember whether or not she had grasped the rose in the vase. "So, what were you and old Zach talking about out there?" Charlie inquired, catching her off guard. "Nothing," she exclaimed. She told him that they were only talking about their yards and trending topics, but Charlie didn't seem to care. She asked him if he was so angry about it, then why did he pick her a rose? And Charlie replied by telling her that he hadn't seen the two of them talking until after doing so. He quickly became frustrated with her, proclaiming his strong distaste for Zach, and informed Valerie that he would be in the basement and not to disturb him, before slamming the door to the cellar behind him. There wasn't much of a chance of her following him anyway. She hated that basement. She didn't really know why, but just the thought of entering the cellar below made her panic with fear and disgust, almost shame. Valerie continued about her day, cleaning the house and doing daily activities. It wasn't until later that evening that Charlie would emerge from the basement. The sun was beginning to hang low in the sky beyond the window beside the kitchen table. The smells of a cooking dinner filled the air. Valerie was preparing a whole roasted chicken with the sides of homemade mashed potatoes and freshly picked green beans that she had gathered from the vegetable garden earlier in the afternoon. Valerie opened up the door to the oven and bent down to peer inside at the chicken cooking within. When she did, she heard the creak of the cellar door and the shutting of it soon afterward. Charlie had decided to come out of hiding. "Something smells good," he proclaimed as he rounded the corner and into the kitchen. Valerie stood upright to greet his eyes in the doorway and informed him of the dinner that she was currently making, which was nearly done. Halfway through her speech, she caught notice of the nuances of Charlie's features. His face seemed slightly pale, with shaded rings under his eyes. A small amount of dirt or grime was smeared on his forehead, nearly unnoticeable. She inquired about Charlie's face, when he seemed to grow confused and turned back around to check himself in the bathroom mirror only a few short steps away. "Huh?" Charlie stated with perplexion from inside the bathroom, the door open. "I honestly don't know. My hands are clean," he yelled to Val, who was still in the kitchen. She then re-inquired about his color, and the both of them concluded that maybe he just needed to eat something, as Charlie hadn't done so all day. Valerie's husband went to wash up while she placed the food on the plates set at the quaint kitchen table in the corner. When the food was in place and the glasses filled, Valerie sat herself beside her husband's chair at the head of the table. Momentarily, Charlie came back into the room and was looking a little bit better. He gave his wife a thank you for the dinner and sat down beside her. The two of them became quickly engrossed in talking about old memories of when they started dating and the earlier years of their marriage. Valerie became so caught up that, in fact, she barely remembered eating a thing. It wasn't until her stomach began to pulsate with nauseous pain that she looked down, seeing her plate was nearly empty, and decided to stop consuming the remainder of her dinner. She didn't know why, but there was something about the way she cooked that seemed to make the food so much more filling. She looked over at Charlie just in time to see him push his empty plate aside. "I'm stuffed," Charlie told her with satisfaction. Val stood up and told her husband that she was glad that he enjoyed his dinner. Valerie began to clean up, putting the dishes in the sink and filling it with soapy water. Charlie sauntered into the living room and began to read the daily newspaper. Val was about halfway through the dishes when she heard a knock at the back door. She peered out the window in front of her and strained her eyes to the right. She saw it was Zach from next door. Valerie stood at the sink, hands submerged in bubbles, waiting for her husband to answer the knocking on the door. Moments passed and no such event seemed to be occurring. Flinging one hand into the air, attempting to dry it as much as possible, Valerie opened up the window behind the kitchen sink and yelled out that the door was unlocked and to come inside. An instant afterward, she could hear the door open and the subsequent sound of it shutting. The sound of water running must have given her away because the footsteps could be heard making a beeline for the kitchen of her home. Zach walked in with a hello. Valerie asked him what he was doing there, and he replied, asking that he was there to borrow some greens from her garden. However, he didn't leave when Valerie told him it was fine. Instead, Zach kept getting closer and closer to Valerie as he talked on and on about trivial topics. Valerie was turned around, dripping silverware in her hand by the time Zach made his move and grabbed a hold of her by the waist, closing in for a kiss. It was at this time when Valerie's husband, Charlie, came storming into the kitchen. Without so much as a word, Charlie pulled Zach off his wife, stole the knife that she was holding in her hand, and stabbed Zach in the face with it. Valerie's eyes grew wide in horror before her mouth let out a corresponding shriek. Zach was face up on the floor, Charlie on top of him, stabbing him in the chest and face repeatedly. Blood was spattered throughout the kitchen, pooling in a large puddle underneath her neighbor. Eventually, Charlie stopped, breathing heavy, crouched and glaring at his victim. "What did you do?" Val asked, softly in shock. It seemed like a lifetime before Charlie said something back. "I ended this piece of shit. That's what I did." He finally spoke up. "Listen, I'm gonna take care of this. You go grab me some cleaning supplies from the bathroom closet. I'm gonna take care of dipshit here." Valerie did what he told her, tears leaking from her eyes. Someone would notice him missing. As he headed into the bathroom, she could hear Charlie dragging the body into the basement, closing the door behind him. By the time she had returned with what he had asked for, Charlie came back through the now opening basement door. "Listen, I'm going to start on this. I need you to go into the cellar and grab me the red can of gasoline. You can't miss it. It's right next to the stairs." Valerie just stared at him, still in shock. And Val, "Stay out of the back room down there." Valerie barely nodded as she dreamily passed her husband and grasped the knob of the cellar door. The door opened with a creak and presented an old wooden staircase that seemed to lead down into nothing more than a black void. Slowly, she began to creep down the creaking stairs, and with the sound of each creak, the sounds of cleaning upstairs became more and more faint, diminishing into nothing by the time she had touched her sock to the basement floor. The gas can was easily identifiable right next to her feet, but she found her eyes were lingering on the door on the opposite side of the room. At one point, she nearly just grabbed the can and went back up the stairs. But she just couldn't. There was something behind that door. Something she was terrified of. It wasn't the corpse of her neighbor. Something else. Valerie had to at least know what it was she was afraid of, why she feared entering the cellar at all. Her heart quickened with every step across the dark expanse of the basement, nearly pounding out of her chest by the time she reached for the handle. Fighting past the lump in her throat, Valerie opened the door. Her face grew white as her eyes filled with horror and panic. Memories from what seemed as if it could have been from another life surfaced to her conscious thoughts. She remembered a time when she and Charlie weren't so happy. Charlie was always working late and leaving Valerie to tend the house, practically keeping her captive. One night, when Valerie was nearly asleep in bed, she heard her husband come home from what he said was a really long day at the office. She was told this when she jumped out of bed to confront him. Charlie smelled of alcohol and perfume, so drunk he could barely speak. The two of them were arguing back and forth in the upstairs hall. It was when Charlie reached the stairs, trying to get some sleep on the couch, that Valerie grabbed his arm and demanded an explanation. Charlie then told her that he had met someone. She pushed him as hard as she could. She couldn't understand. How could this be? Charlie was still here. This couldn't have happened. "I told you," Charlie said from behind her. "How? I don't understand." "Hun, you picked that flower. That's how you got the thorn in your hand." Valerie began to realize the truth. She remembered. It was her. She plucked the flower from the rosebush out front before coming in and placing it in the vase. She was over full every night from clearing 2 dinner plates. When she pushed Charlie down the stairs all those months ago, he had broken his neck by the time he had landed at the bottom floor. Charlie had never taken the knife from her hand and killed Zack. Valerie turned to take one last confirming look into the room beyond. In the corner, next to their neighbor, was the rotting corpse of her husband.
Well, when memory doesn't serve you right, you have the perfect excuse: insanity. But don't go crazy with desire, and make sure to stop back again next weekend. And until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.